Larry Taunton, Executive Director of Fixed Point Foundation, and what you're about to see is a debate at a Fixed Point Foundation event at Princeton University entitled, "Can There Be Morality Without God?" Now, it should be said that Fixed Point Foundation is a Christian organization, and unashamedly so. Nonetheless, we endeavor to engage on these issues in a fair and open dialogue. Representing the Christian position in this discussion is Dinesh D'Souza, a best-selling author and a man who has written extensively on these topics. Arguing the atheist position is controversial author and Princeton bioethicist Peter Singer, a man who many regard as the father of the modern animal rights movement and as the most influential philosopher of the second half of the 20th century and beyond. We think you'll find this particular debate enlightening and stimulating, and it's our hope that it will cause you to reflect on your own position on these questions just a little more deeply. Thank you.
Good evening and welcome to tonight's event. My name is Justin Woyak and I am the president of Princeton Faith in Action. On behalf of all those in attendance tonight, I would like to sincerely thank Professor Singer and Mr. D'Souza for their being here with us and for their enthusiasm about tonight's topic. I would also like to thank those who helped plan this event and for our sponsors, Christian Union and the Fixed Point Foundation, who have made this event possible. It is our hope that tonight's event stimulates engaging and thoughtful conversation about this important subject across our campus. Now let me introduce our moderator this evening, our very own Professor Eric Gregory of the Religion Department at Princeton. Having been educated at Harvard, Oxford, and Yale, Professor Gregory finally made it to Princeton in 2001. In 2007, he was awarded the Princeton's President's Award for Distinguished Teaching. I myself am fortunate to have a class with him this semester, and we are fortunate to have him as our moderator this evening.
Friends, let me add my welcome to you and my thanks to Justin and our sponsors for tonight's exciting debate between Peter Singer and Dinesh D'Souza. And my task as moderator is to keep us on time. So let me invite you, as they say at the movies, a second time to please turn off your cell phones and perhaps at this point gently remind you of the best of Princeton's traditions of public dialogue, spirited inquiry, and mutual respect. Our topic is, can there be morality without God? A question that admits many possible senses, and we leave it to our speakers to define the terms in their response. The format is as follows. Each speaker will be given a 15-minute opening statement, followed by 5 minutes of rebuttal and 5 minutes of cross-examination for each speaker. We will then open the floor to questions, which will be solicited on note cards found in the program and collected after the opening statements. Each speaker will have 3 minutes for a closing statement, and we will wrap things up about 10:15 with the question resolved, or perhaps better questions raised, and just in time for the students to go back to the library. Our distinguished speakers are prolific, provocative, and influential. They are widely acclaimed both inside and outside the academy. Peter Singer is the Ira W. DeCamp Professor of Bioethics at the University Center for Human Values here at Princeton University, a position he has held since 1999. He was educated at the University of Melbourne and the University of Oxford. Professor Singer was the founding president of the International Association of Bioethics and founding co-editor of the journal Bioethics. He first became internationally known after the publication of Animal Liberation in 1975. His many other books include Practical Ethics, How Are We to Live?, Rethinking Life and Death, One World, The President of Good and Evil, and The Way We Eat, Why Our Food Choices Matter. His newest book, The Life You Can Save, Acting Now to End World Poverty, will be published in March. Dinesh D'Souza is a former scholar at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. Before joining the Hoover Institution, Mr. D'Souza was the John M. Olin Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. In 1987, he served as senior policy analyst at the Reagan White House. He graduated Phi Beta Kappa from Dartmouth College in 1983. And Mr. D'Souza's many books include the New York Times bestsellers, What's So Great About America, and his 1991 book, Illiberal Education. His latest book is titled, What's So Great About Christianity? We begin with Professor Singer.
Thank you very much, Eric, for that introduction. I'd like to thank Princeton Faith in Action, Christian Union and Fixed Point Foundation as well for making this event possible. I'm speaking here tonight because I think that it's important that universities should discuss the big issues, and certainly this is one of those big issues. Can there be morality without God? And I want to focus for a moment on that question, that we are discussing that particular question, whether there can be morality without God. We are not discussing any particular set of moral views held by any particular atheist, and that includes the views that I hold. I mention this, you might think I needn't be that specific, because there was a press release circulated by the Christian Union a few days ago which referred to an earlier debate that Dinesh D'Souza and I had had on a different topic, and then stated, the Princeton debate promises to be even more heated as the topic is deliberately framed to focus attention on Singer's controversial views on ethics and morality. Well, I have to say that was news to me, and I think that if that's what you're here for, you might leave now. Because it's obvious that that wouldn't answer the question that we're talking about. In other words, you can't argue Peter Singer's morality is the morality of an atheist. Peter Singer's morality is indefensible. Therefore, the morality of atheists is indefensible in general. That would be just like arguing Osama bin Laden's morality is the morality of a theist. Osama bin Laden is a theist, therefore the morality of theists is indefensible. Neither is a valid argument. So I want to focus on the particular question that we are discussing without getting distracted by issues about whether views that I hold are or not right. If Faith in Action or Christian Union want to come back and organise a debate some other time specifically about my views, I'll be happy to do that. That's not what we're doing tonight. What we are doing tonight is to discuss the issue that is often summed up in the contention famously put forward by Ivan Karamazov in Dostoevsky's The Karamazov Brothers, where he said, actually he didn't exactly say this, it isn't a quote, but it is a reasonable summary, if there is no God, everything is permitted. So I want to say, well, should we believe that? Why should we believe that? Why would anyone think, for example, consider any of the atrocities that we have sadly had to witness in this century, young as it still is? Think about 9/11, think about Darfur, or about the Congo, what's been happening there, or more recently, just very recently, fresh in our memories, what happened in Mumbai. And ask yourself, well, if there were no God, would all that be permitted? One question that you might occur to you then is, well, what do you mean, permitted by whom? So, obviously, these actions, these atrocities, are not permitted by law in any nation, as far as I'm aware, these sorts of things. And even now internationally, we have a developing body of international law. We have an international criminal court which exists to make sure that even where these crimes are not prosecuted in the country in which they're committed, that they are against international law and that people can be tried in the International Criminal Court, despite the best efforts of the professedly Christian administration of this country over the last 8 years to undermine the status of the International Criminal Court and to refuse to be part of it. So these things are not permitted by law, but of course we're not really talking about law, we're talking about morality. You might say, if you're a theist, that such acts are prohibited by God, and if there's no God, well, obviously they're permitted. Well, certainly it's true that if you're an atheist, you can't say they're prohibited by God. But first, the fact that theists can say that some acts are prohibited by God doesn't make it true that they are. And if there is no God, then it's obviously also not true that they're prohibited by God. That statement is false. So I'm just going to take 1 minute of my time, perhaps, to say why I think they can't be prohibited by God, because there isn't a God in the sense of a God in the Judeo-Christian tradition. There are other gods about which perhaps I might have other doubts, but the God of the Judeo-Christian tradition is supposed to be a God who is omniscient, omnipotent, and omnibenevolent, all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-good. And if you look at the world around us, indeed, if you look at some of the very events that I've been describing, I don't think there could be such a God in this world, because such a God would not permit these events to take place. Now, if you might say, well, these events that I've described occur through human free will, and for some reason that's a greater good than the evils that humans commit, that still doesn't resolve the problem, because there's also immense suffering that occurs without any intervention of human free will. For example, people die not only because they're killed by other humans, but they die in droughts, and they die in floods, and they die in earthquakes. And often these people are innocent of any conceivable sin because perhaps they're a year old, and they die slow, lingering deaths. And it's hard to see how that can be justified or defended by free will. And even if, although I think this is a repellent doctrine, you were to say they suffer because they too have original sin, since they are descended from Adam and Eve, as indeed some Christians would say, we still have the insoluble problem of the suffering of non-human animals who are not descended from Adam and Eve, do not take part in original sin, and yet suffer slow, lingering deaths in droughts and famines and earthquakes, just as humans do. So I think there is no reconciliation of the existence of that kind of suffering and the kind of God of the Christian and Jewish traditions. So I think that it's not a good argument to say that these things are not permitted because God prohibits them, because you would need to defend the idea that such a God exists. So I think that the question, can there be morality without God, really comes to a question of, can there be morality, given that we are in a universe without God? But of course, we can suspend our disbelief in God and ask questions about what difference would it make to morality if there were a God. So let's again then ask, why would one think that these acts that I mentioned, that I'm sure we all think and I think are morally wrong, would not be morally wrong if there were a God? And I'm going to mention 3 claims that people might make in defense of this. So the first claim is that the very concepts I'm using, the expressions right or wrong, even good or bad, would be meaningless if there were no God. They only have meaning in a universe with God because what they really mean, good and something we're obliged to do, mean right, that God wills them. And conversely, that something is wrong or bad, we ought not to do it, means that God wills that they not exist or that they not be done. So we have a meaning to the words through God's will and God's commands. This is a famous position, but also one that has been famously refuted right in the early stages of Western philosophy in Plato's Euthyphro, where essentially the argument was, so what about these things that I've talked about, say? Obviously Plato wasn't talking about those things, but what about these things? Are they only wrong because God says they are wrong? Or does God say does God condemn them, does God command that we not do them because they are wrong? And I think that's very puzzling for the person who defends the view that there is no meaning to right or wrong without the existence of God. Because if you say that they're only wrong because God wills them, or wills the good, condemns the bad, then you're essentially saying that God could have willed the opposite. God could have willed that we drop bombs on villages consisting entirely of civilians. God could have willed that we hack off the limbs of children in order to carry out our civil war in the Congo or in Darfur. And that would have been the right thing to do if God had willed it. And you can't say God wouldn't have willed it because it would have been wrong, because on this conception there is no meaning to it being wrong except that God wills it. So that doesn't seem a very plausible position to take. We really have to take the view that these things would have been wrong, that God, if you like, if you believe in God, condemned them because they were wrong of their nature, of their intrinsic nature. But then you have to admit that there is a meaning to the concept, at least, of right and wrong, independent of God's command. God doesn't give that term meaning, it has meaning prior to him. So the first claim, I think, does not survive that argument. The second claim sometimes made is, we can't know what is right or wrong without God's revelation to guide us. So yes, the terms have meaning, but we would be lost. We would be at sea, not able to separate right from wrong. Well, if there were a God, and if he had revealed his will about what is right or wrong, in clear and indisputable language that we could all accept, then perhaps you could run this line. Then perhaps you could say, God did reveal to us what is right or wrong. But he did not do that. It's quite extraordinary how often religious people refer to some sacred text as if it were the source of all moral knowledge, and then ignore half, the inconvenient half, of course, of what it actually says. And we have plenty of examples of that in the Christian world today, including in this country. For we're living in a society in which most people, anyway, say that they are Christian. And yet, they ignore the repeated insistence of Jesus in the Gospels that everyone, and especially the rich, should give to the poor. You remember that bit of it? You remember when he told the rich man, sell all your possessions and give them to the poor? In case you didn't get the message, he went on to say, it's as hard for a rich man to go to heaven as a camel to go through the eye of a needle. That sounds like it's not a good policy to remain rich if you want to go to heaven, doesn't it? Yet there's lots of rich Christians still in this country. That's a bit of the gospel that they don't really seem to want to follow. And there's lots of other injunctions, for example, many of them in the same course. He urged those who give feasts to invite the poor, the maimed, the lame and the blind. Most of you probably had a feast last Thursday. Hands up, those who invited the poor, the maimed, the lame, the blind. Don't see a lot of hands. I see one or two hands. Very good. Congratulations. That's excellent. That's nice to see. But there's about 800 people in this room, and I saw a dozen or so hands maybe. So I think that we are not actually getting our guidance. People, Christians generally, do not follow. They choose selectively which bits of the Bible they want to follow. Consider what Jesus is reported to have said about divorce. Divorce, he said, either is just wrong altogether, depending which bit of the Gospels you read, or it's only permitted on the grounds of adultery. There's not many Christians, there are some, but there's not many Christians who adhere to that. Even fewer adhere to the idea that to marry a divorced woman is itself to commit adultery. Don't know a lot of Christians who refuse to marry a divorced woman. Not a divorced man, apparently, by the way. Not too sure exactly what the basis of that distinction is. On the other hand, Christians in this country seem to think that they have a lot of guidance from God, from Christianity, about views about abortion, about the use of obtaining stem cells from embryos, about homosexuality. There's no clear guidance in the Gospels anyway, in the New Testament, about that. People may say, well, it's not just the New Testament, we go to the Old Testament as well. But once you go to the Old Testament, you find a lot of amazing things that God is supposed to have said and commanded, and your job of working out which ones you want to follow is more difficult than ever. For example, God explicitly advocates genocide in the Old Testament. Not passages probably very often read in church, but look at Numbers 31, where God commands the Israelites to wreak his vengeance on the Midianites. And when they go there and destroy their villages and kill their cattle and slaughter the men, they bring back to Moses the women and the children. And Moses is angry. Moses said, why have you spared the women and the children? Go and kill them. Go and kill all the women who have known men by lying with them. And kill all the boys. But the girls who haven't known men, keep them for yourselves. Is that where you want to take your moral guidance from? I don't think so. So the scriptures that we have are not guidance to moral thinking. If we want to use them, we have to use our own judgment. We have to sort out for ourselves what's right and wrong. And that's what we're doing anyway, whether we take the scriptures as a sacred text or just take them as an interesting work of literature to discuss and think about. 2 minutes? Thank you. Okay. So let me move to the third claim. The third claim is that even though the terms right and wrong make sense, and even though we can find out what is right and wrong, nevertheless, people won't do it. This is perhaps what Ivan actually had in mind in the Karamazov brothers, because one thing he actually does say, this is a quote, if there is no immortality, there is no virtue. Now, I admit it would be nice to believe that all the virtuous are going to be rewarded in an afterlife and all the wicked are going to be punished in an afterlife. And it would be even better, of course, if people believed that and acted in their long-term self-interest so that they didn't do things that they believed to be wrong because of this concern about punishment. But it actually doesn't seem to work. It's quite an interesting sociological fact. Of course, I think it's difficult to believe in the first place for reasons that I've spelled out, but it doesn't really seem to work. That is, when we compare more Christian countries with less Christian countries, like this one, for example, with European countries that have a lower level of religious belief and observance, we find that many of the things that Christians condemn are actually more common here. Murder is more common in this country. We have a higher prison rate. And incidentally, some statistics I saw, a little bit dated, suggested that the number of atheists in prison was less than 1%, whereas of the prison population, whereas in the population as a whole, it's regarded as being perhaps 5, 8, 10%, considerably disproportionate, fairly small number of atheists in prison. Maybe they're just clever and don't get caught, of course. But let's go on. Abortion rates, teenage pregnancy rates, they're also higher in this country. Juvenile, we also don't look after despite the injunctions I talked about, we don't look after the poor as well in this country as we do in Europe. We have higher rates of poverty and we have less social support for those who are in poverty. And then, of course, we have the mystery of the various religious people, both evangelicals and Catholic priests, who are constantly talking about sin, constantly emphasising sexual sins in particular, and are constantly committing them. Well, it's puzzling, isn't it, that if they believe in punishment in the afterlife, this doesn't seem to help them to control their urges, which we all have and which are sometimes difficult to control, but it doesn't seem to be successful in helping them to urge it. So I would say that none of these grounds, just sort of one more point, none of these grounds really would help us to believe in a morality without God. So I'm sure Dinesh is going to say that I've said a lot of negative things, but I haven't said anything about what ethics is. So I think since I'm out of time now, but I do have some time coming up after Dinesh has spoken, I'm going to say, hold on, you will get the answer to that question after we've heard from Dinesh.
Dinesh D'Souza.
I want to say how pleased and delighted I am to be here. I didn't go to Princeton. I went to Dartmouth, and I must say I was a little bit of a rebel when I was a student there. I edited a conservative campus newspaper that was a kind of thorn in the side of the Dartmouth administration, and we used to tell the deans that taking on our rebel paper was a bit like wrestling with a pig. Not only did it get everyone dirty, but the pig liked it. And it is in that spirit that I come here to tussle with Peter Singer, you might say on his home turf, Princeton University. It falls to me to have the task, since Peter Singer, I think for understandable reasons, does not want to discuss his views. And so it is going to be, I guess, my task to discuss them. But not in the mode of arguing that this is proof that atheism doesn't work. Rather, I want to discuss Peter Singer's work as the effort of a very rare and gifted man attempting to develop, you might say, a truly secular morality, working out the consequences of what could be called true secularism. Now, why is this important? This is important because many of us think we live in secular culture. Hey, Princeton University is a secular campus. But right away, in this building itself, we have some clues that that's not entirely true. Princeton wasn't founded as a secular institution. It has ideas and institutional frameworks and codes that are very much derivative of its Christian origins. And in some senses, you may say it is subsisting on capital derived from its own unique theological and intellectual and educational history. We say Europe is secular, but if you walk around Europe, you find yourself drenched in Christian institutions, Christian monuments, Christian cathedrals, Christian symbols, and arguably the culture of Europe, even the culture that secularists and atheists champion, is in fact powerfully shaped by Christian assumptions, sometimes hidden Christian assumptions. So what I would like to do, if I may, is I want to begin with just a quote or two from Peter Singer, because I want to then expound a little bit later on the meaning of these quotes. He says, for example, that if we compare a severely defective human infant with a non-human animal, a dog or a pig, for example, we will often find the non-human to have superior capacities, both actual and potential, for rationality, self-consciousness, communication, and so on. What he's really getting at here is that we give to infants and sick people, particularly the mentally handicapped, rights. And his point is, why do we? We don't give the same rights to, well, he says right here, he says, we don't give the same rights to pigs and chickens. He says the calf, the pig, and the much derided chicken come out ahead of the newly born infant in terms of sentience, comprehension, perhaps anticipating the future. Now, frankly, I find all of this a little disturbing, in part because I had chicken for lunch. And when I read this, it made me feel a bit like a cannibal. But what Peter Singer's getting at here is, in a sense, rights do not accrue because we are human. And for this reason, he says, and I want to quote him so I'm not getting him wrong, he says, in our book, Should the Baby Live?, my colleague Helga Kusi and I suggested that a period of 28 days after birth might be allowed before an infant is accepted as having the same right to life as others. The point he's trying to get at is he's not discussing abortion. He's saying that an infant, perfectly healthy, in essentially the first month after birth, has no rights and can be killed for any reason, or any good reason perhaps. Now, in some senses, when I say this to people, they sometimes say, Peter Singer, he's a provocateur, he's just saying things to get people going and so on. I want to argue that this actually is unfair to Peter Singer and what he is trying to do. In some ways, what he's trying to do is very different than a lot of other, I've been debating several other of the so-called new atheists. Christopher Hitchens, the biologist, Richard Dawkins, and so on. And to a man, what those guys say is something like this. Sure, we can be moral without God. You don't need God to have morality. Because if Christians can do good stuff, be honest, kind, just, do charity, atheists can too. If there's a big famine in Rwanda tomorrow, the Christian can shed a tear, volunteer his or her time, write a check. But the new atheists say, well, we can do that too. God is superfluous. You don't have to believe in God in order to be moral. Now, on the surface, this, I think, is correct. I would not argue for a moment that Christians have any kind of monopoly on virtue or that atheists are not capable of it. But I think what it misses is it misses a deeper point. And that is that even if you make a list of all the values that secular people or atheists cherish, if you read the books of the new atheists, they say, we believe in the idea of the individual. We believe in the autonomy of science. We believe in the equal dignity of women. We believe in the worth of human life. We believe in compassion as a social virtue. And my point is, okay, but these values came into the West, and in some cases into the world, because of Christianity. How do we know this? It's pretty simple. First of all, we look at other cultures. Peter Singer mentioned a great famine. If there was a great famine in Rwanda tomorrow, you'd notice something rather interesting. All the Western countries would immediately rally, Doctors Without Borders, the Red Cross, missionaries, and so on. And in other cultures, China, India, there would be a kind of great silence. Why? When I grew up in India, we learned a proverb that says, in effect, the tears of strangers are only water. The basic idea here is you look after people when they are your people. But if someone is nothing to you, you wish them well, but you have no obligation to them. This idea of universal brotherhood is, in effect, a Christian idea. Consider the idea of the value of human life. You wouldn't find that value very powerfully present in ancient Greece or Rome before Christianity. The Spartans, we all know, would take the sick or defective child and stick it on the hillside and be perfectly happy to find it dead in the morning. Peter Singer cites such facts to, in a sense, recommend them, to say, hey, look, what the ancient Greeks and Romans did, what the Bushmen of the Kalahari do, we should reconsider. We should bring back into our civilization. Consider the idea of compassion. Aristotle makes a list of the virtues. Compassion never appears on that list. In fact, elsewhere in Aristotle, compassion is treated more as a vice. So how did compassion become, if you will, the central political virtue of Western civilization? It became that because of Christianity. Or consider the idea of equal rights, which I take it pretty much everyone in this room believes in, the equal dignity of women, the abolition of slavery. The fact is, slavery is a universal institution. We find it in China, in India, in ancient Greece and Rome, in Africa. There were slaves in the Americas long before Columbus got here. Anti-slavery, the movement to contest slavery, is uniquely Christian. and in some senses developed only in one civilization and not elsewhere. In fact, for many, many millennia, slavery needed no defenders because it had no critics. It was like the family, taken for granted. So how did slavery become controversial? Well, first of all, many people think that slavery was abolished only in the modern era. Not true. Slavery was mostly abolished in Europe between the 4th century and the 10th century, replaced by serfdom, to be sure, which is not exactly a walk in the park, but at least it isn't being owned by some other guy. And then in the modern era, Christians began to take a theological proposition: we are created equal in the eyes of God, and derive from it a political corollary. Since we are created equal in the eyes of God, no man has the right to rule another man without his consent. And this idea becomes the basis not only of anti-slavery or abolition, it also becomes the basis of democracy. Because modern democracy, if you think about it, is based on the simple notion that no man, no person has the right to rule another without consent. So the point I'm trying to get at here is that much of what we call secular morality is itself standing, you might say, on a Christian pedestal. And all you have to do is probe it a little. Even Peter Singer's morality, I will show, has rooted in it Christian assumptions that he seems unwilling or reluctant to acknowledge. And I want to make a second point. Morality is a fact in the world. It's real. I'm not just talking, by the way, about the morality of the 10 Commandments. Thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal. When faced with the choice of 2 evils, always choose the one you haven't tried before. Oops, that's not the 10, that's Mae West. Anyway, the point I'm making is we have all these moral codes. We have all these moral codes. And the question becomes, can these moral codes be understood better if you assume that there is a God, or if you assume that there isn't a God? In other words, does morality require what can be called a transcendental foundation, or can you explain morality, you might say, in purely secular terms? Let's consider the secular explanation, which is, in effect, we are evolved Darwinian primates. That's what we are, and that is all that we are. And I ask you, what sense does this make of morality? If we are evolved Darwinian primates, we are driven by an imperative to survive, to reproduce, to, you may say, acquire power, to consolidate our position in the world and in nature. And we do all those things. That's the Darwinian side of us. But I think everyone in this room knows that there is another side, not only to us, but in us, that not only seems inexplicable on the Darwinian account, but it seems to actively subvert and defy the Darwinian account. I'll give a simple example so everyone knows exactly what I mean. Let's say I'm walking on the riverbank, and I hear someone shout, "Help, help, help, I'm drowning." My initial instinct is to look over and see the guy flailing around in the water. I notice that he weighs 250 pounds. I notice also that I'm not a very good swimmer. And I feel this powerful Darwinian imperative to keep going. I ask myself, is this my brother? Is it a relative? It's someone I care about? No, it's a total stranger. I've never seen that guy in my life. Why on earth should I risk anything to help that guy? Keep going, Dinesh. But the moment I take steps forward to keep going, a little lamp lights on in my head, and another voice, not mine, begins to speak against this and say, in effect, Dinesh, that's not right. You should try to help the guy. At least give him a stick and pull him to the shore. Of course, my Darwinian voice fires back and says, in effect, no, what are you talking about? The guy weighs 250 pounds. Is it more likely you'll pull him out or he'll pull you in? In other words, why take the chance? But if I keep going, if I listen, you may say, to my Darwinian instinct, I feel this powerful sense of qualms and anxiety and frustration. There is, in a sense, the unavoidable sense that I'm doing something wrong. It is almost as if it's not just a feeling, it's not just a reason, it is almost as if, you may say, there is a transcendental voice that is speaking within me that has no power to coerce me, but has every power, in a sense, to establish an ineradicable standard that even I, try as I may, cannot resist paying attention to. My question is, where does this transcendental, powerful sense that is within us, where does that come from? What is its Darwinian foundation? The bottom line is I'm saying that whether or not we disagree on the margin about this morality or that morality, we all know that as human beings we are moral creatures. And by moral creatures, what I mean is we have moral standards. Standards that we did not create. Now, we may not live up to those standards. Peter Singer's right about that. But that proves absolutely nothing. It simply means the standards are better than us. Quite frankly, if we devise them, most likely we would not devise standards that we could not live up to. The fact is, we embrace standards, you may say, that set a bar that none of us can fully jump over or scale. Now, in some senses, this idea that we are Darwinian primates can generate an attempt to create, you might say, secular morality. One reason I'm interested in Professor Singer's work is he says very clearly, he says, many of the things that we take for granted, for example, take the idea that human life is sacred. He says that is not, if you will, morality, that's Christian morality. He says man is on a Darwinian continuum with the beasts. We're not special, we're no different. He goes, but what Christianity has done, and what man has done more generally, is take Homo sapiens and put him on this pedestal and assign to him special protections and special rights, which are at, you may say, while demeaning the rest of creation. Sort of the biblical idea that the rest of creation is now man's to use for his instrumental purposes. And what Singer says is that once we realize that God is dead, we've got to reverse all this. We cannot do what the new atheists want to do. The new atheists want to kill God, but keep Christian values of liberty, equality, compassion, and so on. And Singer can't do it. If you want to kill God, there goes human dignity. There goes the idea of the specialness of human beings. There goes the idea of human rights. Why he's working at an institute for human values, I have no idea. But nevertheless, now, the point I want to make is this. If we want to look at what secular morality really is, if we want to see if Dostoevsky is right, if God is not, everything is permitted, we cannot look to Belgium or France. We have to look really to the communist regimes of the 20th century, efforts to really, you might say, purge Christianity, shut down the churches, kill all the priests, establish the new man and the new utopia, liberated from the shackles of traditional religion and traditional morality. And when you look at the body count of those atheist regimes, by the way, a body count that would make a bin Laden blush, even a junior league atheist like Pol Pot in Indochina managed to kill about 2 million people in the short space of 3 years. So atheism, you might say, not religion, is responsible for the mass murders of history. Peter Singer, when he advocates infanticide, when he advocates euthanasia, and when in the same breath he advocates animal rights, he puzzles some people, but he is really, in a sense, thinking through the implications of atheism. He's saying if you remove God, man comes down from the pedestal and the natural continuum with the animals is restored. I know that because Singer has advocated the killing of infants and so on, the killing of the handicapped, some people have said he's a Nazi. And he has protested this and said, this is ridiculous, I'm not a Nazi. And I think in a way he's right. Because the Nazis advocated, you might say, state-sponsored genocide. What Peter Singer advocates is actually something very different. Private sector homicide. In other words, don't make the government do it. You do it. Now, I cite Singer's work not to prove atheism or God, but to show you that secularism, when you really remove the religious presuppositions, is a little bit of a frightening idea. We might be moving in that direction, but if we do, the next time you have someone over for dinner, just make sure to count your spoons. Thank you very much.